This is unacceptable. You will not ruin this for me.
No, I didn't mean. Oh my God.
I was standing beside a long marble table when I noticed the signature. It was on a catering contract worth more than most people's homes. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, and it wasn't Victoria's. Her name appeared neatly typed beneath it. But the signature belonged to someone else entirely. And what made the room go quiet wasn't just that the bride hadn't signed it. It was that, in the margin, under legal point of contact, the document listed Betty Spencer. No explanation, no annotation, just an assumption made permanent in ink. I've planned weddings for decades, and I've learned that the first sign of a power shift is rarely loud. It's administrative. It hides in paperwork, in copied emails, in decisions that arrive already finalized. This one arrived with invoices attached and a payment schedule that no one remembered approving. Victoria was standing across from me, flipping through printed pages she'd never seen before. Every question she asked was answered by someone else. Every pause was filled on her behalf. And each time she looked toward Blake Foster, he said nothing. Not avoidance. Not confusion. Silence. At that moment, Betty Spencer was already acting as if the hierarchy had been decided. Vendors responded to her emails immediately. Meetings were scheduled around her availability. Legal language started appearing where there had once been preferences and aesthetics. The wedding had become a structure, and someone had quietly positioned herself at the top. What no one in that room acknowledged yet was how much documentation was being created in real time, how many permissions were being implied instead of granted, and how dangerous it is in families like this to mistake silence for consent. Because silence, when it ends, doesn't do so gently, and when it finally does, it doesn't correct details. It collapses authority. I first met Victoria Spencer at a private luncheon arranged to celebrate the engagement. That was the language used. Celebration implies symmetry, equal voices, shared excitement, a future being shaped together. What I walked into felt closer to an orientation. The table was already set when Victoria arrived. Name cards placed, seating decided. A printed agenda slid discreetly under each plate. The venue manager greeted Betty Spencer first, by name, with the ease of someone who had already been briefed. Victoria hesitated for just a second before sitting. It was subtle. The kind of pause you only notice when you're trained to watch for it. She scanned the table, as if checking whether she was late to her own life. Betty didn't wait for everyone to settle. She spoke about the engagement announcement as if she had authored it. The timing, the guest list, the press angle. She referenced calls already made, deposits already handled, expectations already communicated to extended family and donors. Each sentence assumed continuity, as if authority had flowed naturally to her the moment the ring appeared. Victoria tried to interject once, just once. A small clarification about the venue she preferred. Betty smiled warmly, publicly, and corrected her, not sharply. Gently, the way one corrects a misunderstanding rather than a decision. Blake Foster sat beside Victoria, hands folded, posture relaxed. He listened, not passively, intently. He asked no questions, offered no confirmations. His silence didn't slow the conversation, it accelerated it. Betty spoke faster, more confidently, as if filling space she assumed was hers to occupy. That was the first imbalance, not the money, not the status. The assumption, after the lunch, vendors followed up with Betty. Not because she demanded it, because she behaved as if it were already agreed. When people operate at that level of wealth, certainty becomes its own credential. Confidence reads as authorization. Victoria began receiving summaries instead of invitations. Decisions arrived fully formed, accompanied by phrases like "we discussed" and "we agreed," referring to meetings she hadn't attended. Each message placed her one step further from the center of her own wedding. And Blake remained silent. What most people don't understand about silence at this level is that it creates a vacuum others rush to fill. Betty didn't seize control overnight. She stepped into empty space, piece by piece, while everyone else adjusted around her presence. By the end of that week, the engagement no longer felt like a union between two people. It felt like a transfer of operational command. Betty Spencer began referring to herself as a solution before anyone had named a problem. It happened in conversations that sounded helpful on the surface. She spoke about logistics the way seasoned executives do, calmly, decisively, without visible ego. She didn't announce control, she framed it as inevitability. "Someone has to coordinate," she said once, as if coordination were a natural extension of motherhood. I watched her reposition herself in rooms without ever moving her chair. Emails started arriving from her address with subject lines that implied authority rather than request. Updated vendor alignment, revised timeline, confirmed decisions. She copied Victoria instead of addressing her. Blake was almost always included, though never directly spoken to. What made it effective was that Betty rarely asked permission. She announced outcomes, vendors responded because the payments cleared. Accountants responded because the numbers made sense. Lawyers responded because her language mirrored theirs. She didn't bluff, she operated just close enough to legitimacy that no one stopped her. Victoria noticed the shift before anyone else admitted it. She would forward me emails asking, quietly, if this was normal. Not accusatory, uncertain. Each time, I had to answer carefully. Because what was happening wasn't loud enough yet to confront, but it was consistent. Betty began attending fittings, tastings, walkthroughs. She spoke to coordinators as if she were safeguarding an asset. She reframed preferences as risks. A dress choice became a visibility concern. A floral budget became a reputational investment. Everything was translated into a language where authority belonged to the one managing exposure. When Victoria disagreed, Betty didn't argue. She recalibrated. "We'll revisit that," she'd say, then move on as if the matter were already archived. Blake watched it all. He never contradicted his mother. He never validated her either. His silence gave Betty space to expand, and she interpreted that space as endorsement. In families like this, proximity to power is often mistaken for power itself. By the time Betty referred to herself as the primary point of continuity, no one corrected her. And that was the moment she stopped behaving like a guest. She began acting like management. The first time money entered the conversation directly, it did so disguised as efficiency. Betty didn't announce a financial takeover. She introduced a spreadsheet and was printed, color-coded, professionally formatted, columns labeled approved, pending, deferred. Under responsible party, her name appeared more often than anyone else's. Victoria's name appeared in gray, secondary, as if informational rather than decisive. She explained it calmly. The family, she said, needed visibility. With a wedding of this scale, clarity protected everyone. Funds needed to be centralized to avoid confusion. Decisions needed to be streamlined. No one objected, not because they agreed, but because the language sounded reasonable. That was how the first account access request appeared. Not as a demand, as a safeguard. Betty asked to be added to a ceremony-related account temporarily, just to monitor cash flow, just to ensure vendors were paid on time. She referenced Blake's broader financial infrastructure without claiming direct access to it, implying alignment rather than authority. Victoria hesitated. You could see it in the way she reread the email before replying. She asked Blake privately whether this was normal. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, it was brief, non-committal. He said they'd talk later. Later never came. Within days, invoices began clearing faster. Vendors responded more quickly. Problems dissolved before reaching Victoria. On the surface, things improved, which made it harder to name what was being lost. Then came the legal language. Betty started introducing clauses in conversations with planners and advisors, not formal contracts yet, but protective considerations. She spoke about contingencies, about safeguarding family exposure, about ensuring alignment in the event of unexpected complications. She didn't present them to Victoria directly, she discussed them around her office. The most dangerous shift happened when Betty began referencing decisions as already authorized. Blake reviewed this. Blake is comfortable with that structure. Each statement carried weight, not because it was true, but because no one contradicted it. Silence, at this stage, functioned like a signature. By the time Victoria realized that parts of her wedding were being governed by clauses she had never seen, the system was already operating without her input. And Betty, emboldened by momentum, began moving beyond the ceremony. She started touching assets. What made the next phase so effective was that nothing new seemed to be happening. That's how normalization works. The extraordinary becomes routine through repetition, not escalation. Betty didn't increase her presence, she stabilized it. Her involvement stopped being questioned because it stopped changing. Meetings began with her voice, emails closed with her conclusions. Decisions were framed as updates rather than proposals. The structure she'd built now ran on its own momentum. Victoria adapted before she resisted. She started asking fewer questions in group settings. She deferred conversations to private moments that never quite materialized. When she did speak up, she softened her language, as if anticipating correction. And each time she did that, the room adjusted its expectations accordingly. This is the quiet erosion people rarely notice until it's complete. Betty refined her authority by making herself indispensable. She solved problems before they became visible. She redirected concerns away from Blake. She presented herself as the buffer protecting everyone from chaos, and Blake allowed it. From the outside, his silence looked like trust. Internally, it functioned as a test, though no one but him seemed to know that. By now, vendors no longer checked with Victoria at all. They confirmed details with Betty on thematic. Her approval became the fastest path forward. Speed, at this level, is mistaken for legitimacy. The wedding apparatus adjusted around the most decisive voice in the room. What worried me wasn't the control. It was the absence of friction. No resistance meant no recalibration. Betty's authority was no longer borrowed, it was assumed, and once assumption replaces permission, the cost of reclaiming control rises exponentially. Victoria felt it, even if she couldn't articulate it yet. She described the wedding as moving without her, a process unfolding around her rather than with her. Betty called it progress. I recognized it as the calm before an institutional overreach. The shift from coordination to control happened through language first. Betty stopped talking about the wedding as an event and started referring to it as an exposure. She used terms like risk, liability, and precedent, words that don't belong in floral meetings or dress fittings but do belong in boardrooms and courtrooms. She began bringing advisors into rooms where they hadn't been invited. Not formally, casually. A family attorney joining a walkthrough, a financial consultant dialing into a vendor call just to listen. Each presence reframed the conversation. Victoria wasn't introduced to these people, she was informed of them. Betty positioned these expansions as protective. She spoke about alignment between families, about preserving value, about ensuring that no one could later claim misunderstandings. Her tone never hardened, it professionalized. And with that professionalization came documents. Not contracts yet, drafts, memos, discussion papers, each one slightly more specific than the last. Each one circulating just widely enough to create implied consent. Betty never asked Victoria to sign anything. She didn't need to. She relied on momentum. The most telling moment came when a venue coordinator asked Victoria in front of Betty whether a clause limiting last-minute changes had been approved by legal. Victoria froze. She looked at me, then at Betty. Betty answered for her. Yes, she said smoothly. That's already been cleared. Blake was present. He heard it. He said nothing. That silence landed differently now. It didn't read as neutrality. It read as allowance. And Betty interpreted it exactly that way. From that point on, she began referencing authority as if it were already consolidated. She spoke in summaries, not discussions. She framed dissent as inefficiency. She treated Victoria's questions as emotional noise in an otherwise rational process. What she didn't realize was that every expansion required documentation. Every assumption created a trail. Every overreach preserved. By the time Betty attempted to unify ceremony funds with broader family accounts for transparency, the structure she'd built had become measurable, and measurable systems leave evidence. By then, everyone had an opinion about Blake Foster's silence. Some called it detachment. Others assumed indulgence. A few whispered that this was simply how power worked in families like theirs, that the real decisions happened elsewhere, and the wedding was just a performance layer. What they missed was that Blake was present in every room that mattered. He didn't speak, but he listened with precision. He watched how often his name was used to close discussions he had never opened. He noted which vendors deferred automatically to Betty, which advisors addressed him only after she finished speaking, as if checking alignment rather than seeking input. Silence, in his case, wasn't absence. It was data collection. Victoria struggled with it the most. Silence is hardest to endure when you're the one being overridden. She questioned herself constantly. Was she overreacting? Was this just how wealthy families coordinated large events? Was she misinterpreting efficiency as control? Each time she looked to Blake for reassurance, she received calm neutrality. No defense, no confrontation, just presence. That neutrality isolated her. Betty, meanwhile, grew more confident. She began speaking with finality. Her posture changed, she sat straighter. She interrupted more freely. She no longer checked reactions after making decisions. She expected compliance. Silence emboldens the wrong person first. I saw Blake start to adjust his behavior subtly. He stopped responding to group emails altogether. He let Betty speak uninterrupted. He allowed assumptions to crystallize. From the outside, it looked like abdication. From where I stood, it looked like containment. Because when someone believes they've been granted authority, they stop hiding their methods, they stop softening language, they reveal their reach. Betty was no longer careful. And that was the moment the silence became dangerous. Not for Blake, but for her. The dossier didn't begin as a file. It began as an inbox. Blake stopped deleting emails. He archived everything. Vendor confirmations that referenced approvals he never gave. Legal drafts where his name appeared in footnotes without his review. Message threads where Betty spoke on his behalf with increasing confidence. He never corrected them. He let the language stand. What people misunderstand about power at this level is that it rarely relies on confrontation. It relies on record. Silence creates space for others to speak, and speech, when documented, becomes evidence. Betty accelerated once she sensed no resistance. She consolidated conversations. She asked vendors to loop her in directly to avoid delays. She reframed access as efficiency. Each step sounded minor. Each one narrowed the chain of command. Victoria noticed the change in texture before the change in structure. Meetings felt colder, less collaborative. When she spoke, she was acknowledged, then bypassed. Betty would nod, thank her, and redirect the conversation entirely. And Blake watched. He began requesting copies of documents after meetings, not during. Quietly, without explanation. He asked for timelines, for revision histories, for payment authorizations, nothing urgent, nothing alarming. No one refused him, because asking for information is never suspicious. Especially when it comes from the person assumed to be in control. By the time Betty attempted to formalize her role in a written advisory capacity, nothing official, just clarity, the record was complete. Every assumption mapped. Every unauthorized decision time-stamped. The silence had done its work. What Betty didn't understand was that the moment she stopped asking for permission, she started leaving footprints. And footprints, when followed carefully, lead somewhere specific. They lead to exposure. The meeting was scheduled as alignment. That was the word used, not intervention, not correction. Alignment implies that everyone is already moving in the same direction. They just need to synchronize. Two families, legal advisors, financial representatives, a neutral conference room with glass walls and a table long enough to create distance without hostility. Water poured before anyone asked. Betty arrived early. She positioned herself at the head of the table without comment. Papers neatly stacked. Tabs, color-coded, she greeted people by name, including advisors she had introduced into the process herself. Her posture was composed, assured. Victoria sat beside Blake, slightly back, as if already anticipating the dynamic. The agenda opened with Betty speaking. She summarized decisions, presented timings, referenced approvals. She spoke efficiently, confidently, with the cadence of someone accustomed to being deferred to. No one interrupted her, not because they agreed, but because she sounded authorized. Blake listened. He didn't look at the documents in front of him at first. He watched faces, reactions, who nodded, who took notes, who avoided eye contact when Betty referenced his name. She spoke for 20 uninterrupted minutes. When she finished, she looked at Blake not for permission, but for confirmation. That was the moment. He adjusted his chair slightly, not dramatically, just enough to signal transition. He placed a single folder on the table and spoke. Blake didn't raise his voice. He didn't challenge her tone. He didn't reference emotion, family, or respect. He spoke as if he were correcting a structural error, not a person. He opened the folder and slid copies down the table, altered contracts, vendor confirmations, message threads, each document labeled, dated, tracked. He stated calmly that no authority had ever been delegated to Betty Spencer, not verbally, not in writing, not by implication. He referenced specific instances where his name had been used without consent. He clarified that silence was not approval, and assumption was not authorization. Each sentence removed a layer of imagined power. Betty attempted to interject once. He didn't let her, not by interruption, by continuation. He spoke through her words without acknowledging them, maintaining control of the room by refusing to engage her narrative at all. The advisors shifted. Pens paused. Chairs adjusted. The room recalibrated around a new center of gravity. Blake concluded by stating that, effective immediately, Betty was removed from all logistical, legal, and financial involvement in the wedding. All communication would proceed through designated channels. Any deviation would be considered unauthorized. He didn't look at her when he finished. He looked at the table, and no one challenged him. Authority doesn't announce itself when it's real. It executes. Betty sat back slowly, not defeated, recalculating. But the system had already moved on without her. Conversations redirected. Questions addressed elsewhere. The hierarchy reset itself in real time. Victoria didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence had changed hands. The wedding didn't pause after that meeting. It corrected itself. Communication channels tightened overnight. Vendors adjusted without confusion. Contracts were reissued with clean chains of authority. Betty's name disappeared from inboxes, documents, and meeting invites, not ceremonially, but administratively. The most effective removals are always quiet. What followed wasn't backlash, it was absence. Extended family recalibrated their behavior almost immediately. Questions that had once been directed at Betty were rerouted to Blake's team or deferred entirely. Conversations shortened, assumptions evaporated. People became careful again, which is the clearest sign that power has shifted. Victoria changed more slowly, not in posture, in certainty. She stopped asking for validation. She began making decisions without preambles or apologies. When she spoke, the room waited. Not because she demanded it, because the structure now supported her voice. Betty attended the wedding. As a guest, she smiled when appropriate. She remained composed. But she no longer managed space. She no longer corrected language. She no longer spoke for anyone but herself. The system didn't punish her. It simply stopped responding. That is what true consequence looks like in families governed by money and hierarchy. Not humiliation, not confrontation, just removal of access. I've seen many weddings collapse under power struggles like this. What made this one different wasn't the wealth or the documentation, it was timing. Silence, when used correctly, isn't weakness, it's leverage. And when it finally breaks, it doesn't need volume, it only needs proof. If you've ever watched authority shift without a single raised voice, you already understand how these stories end.